Good afternoon and welcome to the Pervasive Media Studio online lunchtime talk. These are live every Friday at 1 p.m, beaming out to you on your smartphones, laptops, iPads and living room TVs. My name is Rachel Burton and I'm a producer at Watershed. These talks are our chance to throw open the digital doors of the Pervasive Media Studio and for you to hear more from the people who are part of our community or who are working on things that excite us. An especially big welcome to those of you who are new to the studio or for whom this may be the first time you're engaging with us. For all of those newcomers, here's a little bit about what we do. The Pervasive Media Studio is a diverse, collaborative community, exploring creativity and technology, exploring everything from comedy to coding and product development to performance art. We're a partnership between Watershed, University of the West of England and University of Bristol. We're a home for early ideas, companies, and a meeting place of both creative and commercial industries. It's a studio space, offering desk space, meeting rooms, events, and opportunities, all for free. It's a safe space for artists to take risks in their practice and make time for collaboration. At Watershed, we also run research projects. During September, the teams behind the Southwest Creative Technology Network and Bristol+Bath Creative R+D have taken over the Lunchtime Talks, showcasing the work of our research fellows and looking at everything from data to digital placemaking and responsible innovation. This is the final talk in this series. I'm a producer for Bristol+Bath Creative R+D, which is funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. We're a collaboration between Bristol+Bath's 4 universities and Watershed that aims to support the region's creative and technology industries. The 5-year programme seeks to forge connections and partnerships in Bristol and Bath, sharing knowledge, creating crossovers, and even greater opportunities in what's already one of the most vibrant clusters in the UK. Our programme is run through what we call pathfinders. In each pathfinder, we bring together new talent, university research, inclusion, and industry practice to address industry-wide challenges through research fellowships and prototypes. Our first Pathfinder set out to explore what we think digital placemaking is and what it could be. We began with a definition provided by leading Bristol digital agency and digital placemaking specialist Calvium, who said, "Digital placemaking aims to enhance and deepen the relationship between people and places. We believe the best examples of digital placemaking are co-designed by different kinds of communities, using digital technology and creative solutions to improve or enhance the public experience of place." Today marks the end of our Reframing Digital Placemaking Week, in which our 7 fellows have done a takeover of the Bristol+Bath Creative R+D Twitter account. And this afternoon you can watch the final takeover by fellow Grace Quantock and get involved on Twitter. All of their brilliant research outputs, which represent more than a year's worth of explorations, have been published on our website, bristol+bathcreative.org, and I really recommend you go and check them out after this talk. For this week's talk, we welcome Roseanna Dias, Stephen Hilton, and Mike Rawlinson. As fellows on the programme, Roseanna and Stephen set out to research and imagine possible future directions for digital placemaking, delving into questions about belonging, safety, hope, and power in public spaces. A commissioning round followed, and we funded 4 prototype projects that answered the brief to expand our understanding of the intersection of digital and physical space and the role of culture in the new digital infrastructure. Mike Rawlinson, Director of City ID, a Bristol-based design and wayfinding company, leads on one of those prototypes, PopMap, a hyper-local, time-sensitive events application, making the invisible aspects of culture in Bristol visible. We're excited to bring our fellows and prototypers together in conversation today, reflecting the kind of dialogue we seek to create through this programme to support R&D across the creative industries in our region. In today's talk, they share their research and different perspectives on localising the internet, exploring what a local digital city might mean to Bristol, Bath and beyond. Please share your responses in the chat to get involved in the conversation. The talk will run for roughly 30 minutes with time for a Q&A at the end. If you want to ask any questions, just pop them in the chat window and I'll pick them out to ask the speakers. Or if you like, you can tweet your questions to @PMStudioUK. A captioned and recorded version of the talk will be available here after the talk is finished. Before we start, next week's talk is Data Poetics. Being in public space has changed, and it has become difficult to sense how a city feels and how to connect to the shared sentiment of a place. As part of Bristol-based arts programme Control Shift, artist Nao Matsuda will be projecting collectivised streams of consciousness back onto the city in her new work, This City Is. Nao is a German-Japanese artist based in London. Her work brings together the ordinary and the absurd to explore notions of labour, internet, culture, emerging technology, and the commons. You can get news on all of our future talks by following us on @PMStudio UK on Twitter or @Pervasive Media Studio on Instagram, or by subscribing to our newsletter via our website. Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel and give the video a thumbs up. The more subscribers we get and the more likes we get, the more we can share stories like this. Please feel free to share the link now on any of your socials so people can watch along. For now, I'm going to hand over to today's speakers. Up first is Stephen Hilton.
Hi, I'm Steve Hilton. Thank you, Rachel. I'm a Digital Placemaking Industry Fellow. I'm also a fellow at the University of Bristol Digital Futures Institute, and I run my own business called City Global Futures. And I think Roseanna's just going to introduce herself briefly as well.
Hi, my name is Roseanna Dias. I'm a creative producer, curator and facilitator based in Bristol, and I'm really interested in creativity and social change. And I particularly focus on film, media, digital tech and supporting young creatives alongside organisations like Rising Arts Agency. And my work really aims to challenge and change the status quo within the culture and tech sectors. And I am an inclusion fellow on the programme. Over to you, Mike.
Hi there, I'm Mike Rawlinson. I'm founding director of City ID. I work here in Bristol with a wonderful team. And also we have another studio in San Francisco. We work mainly for cities and agencies, governments that are interested in improving the way people experience places. And we design products and services to enable people to move around, to enjoy and engage with place. Thank you.
Great. So, start my timer. So, I think all of the fellows on the programme would agree that it's been a pretty extraordinary time to be a digital placemaking fellow. We've lived and worked through multiple global crises, the pandemic, Black Lives Matter and the looming climate emergency. And whilst those weren't the intended focus when I started my fellowship, it's hard to think about the past or the future of cities or places without those things influencing our thoughts. It's also been a time of, I think, unprecedented digital transformation. Through necessity, many aspects of our lives have gravitated online, and we've all spent a lot more time in the digital realm, or many of us have spent a lot more time in the digital realm than we have previously. I've chosen to call my report Rebooting the Digital City, Digital Placemaking at the Edge. And the report's presented in three parts. I start by looking back at the stories that explain how Bristol has become a digital city, really over many decades. In the second part of the study, I look at our visions for digital cities, and particularly a vision that I was involved in producing in 2004 called Connecting Bristol. And I sort of explore whether our thinking about the digital city has altered as a result of having to had to live in one so intently over the last few months. And then in the final part of the report, I consider this idea of relocalizing the internet. And really it's a provocation to explore ideas around whether the pandemic has created an inflection point, a moment in time where we might start to think differently about the internet and the value that it brings to local people and local places. So Mike, if you could flick to my next slide for me. So I started my research by asking the people that I interviewed to identify significant events or milestones that they felt shaped Bristol's journey towards becoming a digital city. It was clear to me that this idea of a digital city wasn't a single plan or a vision or one organisation's work. It was very much a collective endeavour over a long period of time. And so I quickly altered my terminology. I started to think less about milestones. This wasn't a project plan. I started to think about breadcrumbs. It felt like what people were telling me about were almost clues that had been scattered through the city about what the digital city could be and could offer. I started with 5 milestones or breadcrumbs, and through the interviews I've ended up with 55 in the report, and a number of them are presented on this really fantastic illustration, I think. I chose to start the story in 1900 when the telephone exchange, the first battery-powered telephone exchange in the country, opened on Telephone Avenue, which is still off Baldwin Street in central Bristol. And it's fascinating to think that the technology was so important that we named streets after it, not something that we do so much anymore. I don't think there's a wireless way or a 5G walk yet, but it's part of the physicality of the city. So that was my starting point. I skipped forward to the 1970s and the Bristol Channel, which was a prototype local cable TV project where volunteers, particularly in South Bristol and Knowle West, were trained to use equipment in order to create local programming. But the Bristol Channel utilised an infrastructure, a network that was much older. It had been developed by the Western Relay Company in the 1930s and 40s, and then became the Rediffusion Network. And it was, I believe it was created because of the difficulties of broadcasting radio into people's homes. Because Bristol is very hilly, there was a lot of interference in the signal. And so we needed a cable network to pipe radio. That was reused to create the Bristol Channel as a TV project. And through this story and this map, what you see is that network and that infrastructure was rediscovered and reused multiple times. In the early 2000s, it helped to power the I+ kiosks, which were the first touch screen technologies in the UK to be deployed on a city's streets. And Mike, who will be speaking later, was very instrumental through the Legible City programme in bringing that technology to the city. Not only was it the first touchscreen technology, it was also really the first time that locative content was really used. Long before that idea really had formed in the industry's minds. The same network went on to underpin something called StreetNet, which at the time was the UK's largest open wireless network across the centre of Bristol. And then later, through investment in the Super Connected Cities programme, it became the basis for Bristol is Open, a state-of-the-art smart cities Internet of Things testbed. So you can see that there's a sort of relationship between infrastructure, innovation and place. And it's easy for us to think of the history and the story of digital placemaking in terms of global milestones. We think about before or after the iPhone, or before or after Twitter, or we think of 3rd, 4th, 5th generation connectivity. But through this illustration, I tried to reclaim the sense that we have lots of our own local milestones. In the second part of the report, I consider visions and how those might have changed. And I haven't got time to go into a lot of detail around this here. But my sense is that when we were creating visions for what digital cities should be, we were interested in innovation and enterprise and jobs and growth, but we were also equally interested in the social impact that innovation could bring. We talked about all school children having access to online learning. We talked about local high streets and shops thriving because people were working at home or closer to home. So when I looked back at those visions, it was almost like we'd been writing an instruction book for a pandemic, although we didn't realize it. And I guess only certain parts of those visions have moved forward in a very clear way. We can quantify, and we do quantify, the impact of the creative digital high-tech sector on the economy of the West of England. We talk about the billions of GVA that is produced and the numbers of jobs, all of which is really important to building confidence and building an investable city and region. We talk less and we know less, or we're able to quantify less, the impact that that same vision has had on communities. And we aren't able to somehow articulate that in quite the same way. And in the report, I explain why that, some of the factors that help to explain that. And then finally, I sort of introduced this provocation around, is it time? Has this enforced period of digital living, has it given us an opportunity to think again about localizing the internet? And really, I'm thinking about localizing the benefits that the internet can deliver. In the report, I asked people to imagine what would happen if, instead of always calling on Alexa or Siri, we were to say, hey Bristol, or hey Knoll West, or hey Philwood, or any other part of the city, and what sorts of things might happen if we did. And I conclude with this idea that maybe if things continue as they are, that we really need to start to think about the opportunity of the edges of the city. We've all become much more hyper-localized in our worlds over the last 6 months. And both in terms of the physicality of the networks and of the human side of those networks, there's a lot to be gained from thinking about how we invest in the capabilities and the capacities at the edges of the city. So I talk about edge computing and a model of decentralized internet where the computing power and the processing is much nearer to the people and the communities that are creating that data. I also talk about the voluntary and community sector and how we need a different approach to ensuring that people in localities really have the ownership and the confidence to be able to make use of the internet and its benefits to create real local value. And finally, I talk about keeping it edgy. We've always in Bristol pushed the boundaries. We had a wireless city centre network before anybody had wireless devices. Mike was talking about locative content before anybody knew what it meant. So we have an opportunity to continue to be edgy. And I think through the report, I hope that we can be more confident around pushing that as a unique opportunity for the city to thrive. I'm going to hand over to Roseanna, who's been a close colleague as a digital placemaking fellow, and she will tell you about the reports and the research that she's undertaken.
Thanks, Stephen. It was really great to hear the detail of that timeline and your thinking. So I guess for me, when I was thinking about this idea of localizing the internet, really it made me think about the scale that the hyperlocal can bring, that proximity and rootedness in place and in the relationships in a place that mean that our exchanges can become deeper and more meaningful. And the way that my brain works is very much around process and processes and how we do things. And I wanted to talk to you a bit about my project, Spaces of Care, kind of in two ways, really, in the next few minutes. Thinking about my research, which was around creating new or hybrid spaces which focus on care, specifically for Black and POC creatives and change makers, but also thinking about how the themes emerging from that research can also feed into more inclusive practices in digital placemaking. Next slide, please, Mike. So when we think of digital placemaking, it often feels really top down, really fast, really flashy, business, corporate. And in some ways, it can feel like a continuation of colonialist actions, a kind of violence inflicted in places and on people via extractive processes which are upheld by surveillance capitalism, the use of our personal data against us, which I would argue is essentially mining time from our lives through the attention economy. So there's a lot of tensions there, and this process has been an effort to reframe that, really. And the program's offered that opportunity to think differently, to go slower, and that really aligns with my practice. So kind of creating in dialogue with people that you're creating with and for, and particularly through the work at Rising Arts Agency with projects like Whose Culture and Be It, which you can find more information online about. And I wanted to share this quote from Adrian Mary Brown about shifting from mile-wide, inch-deep movements to inch-wide, mile-deep movements, relating to how we need to get away from task-based interactions to people and place-based relationships when we're trying to create change in the world. So what happens really if we consider this in light of digital placemaking? Next slide, please, Mike. So this idea was kind of physically manifested in an early fellows workshop. We used wool, tracing connections and conversations and communities that we each brought with us in that space as fellows. And the threads mapped our cultural ecology, or the kind of networks and systems of culture which determine who gets to be involved in digital placemaking processes. And we held in our hands this complex web of people and place-based connections, conversations, and I think key here is responsibilities that we hold as makers and creators. And so we really need to be mindful of the bias and the blind spots and the normative behaviours that we bring into design processes. And this is something which my inclusion fellow counterpart, Grace Quantock, is exploring in her research. And I'd really encourage you to have a look at that. Next slide, please, Mike. And another question I've been asking is, how can we find ways to reclaim ways of relating to each other outside of norms of production in digital and physical spaces? And as Rabab puts it in this quote, community connectivity has really been deeply impacted by industrialization, globalization, and other forces. And this feels even more relevant given that our sense of place and space has shifted again so rapidly and dramatically in 2020. Given COVID and the recent BLM uprisings of this year, for many Black and POC people, we've been experiencing a level of kind of digital exhaustion and hyper visibility in those spaces that feels really unhealthy. And through the lens of my research, I discovered just how true it was that the revolution will not be Instagrammed, not a thing. My research has shifted from very kind of external facing interventions in public digital space in our cities and online into looking at internal facing explorations of spaces for us and by us, which nurture and nourish and protect. And this kind of responsive shifting and letting go is something that I feel we needs to happen if we're to move with people. Next slide, please, Mike. So in my research, I've been asking questions to elicit stories, generating kind of qualitative data about the themes and feelings at play in what I've been calling spaces of care. And these are some of the themes that kept coming up in my conversations with radical thinkers and creatives, predominantly women of colour. And the spaces we want that are physical, digital, need to be processes which favour joy, which leave room for slowing down, which allow us to access a different quality of attention for ourselves, for each other, where there's no pressure or expectation to perform or create, where we can feel ownership of that space, where collective care is kind of front and centre and facilitated in that space, and where we're able to share our journeys with all this stuff, and where we can step up or step down depending on how we're feeling, where we're given permission to take time out, and where this is maybe modelled for us and made visible through technology. So can these design qualities and principles inform more inclusive digital practices more widely? Next slide, please, Mike. I believe that they can. In thinking about where care and community relate to digital placemaking, I think we can start to reframe the process and the metrics for tech innovation. And in allowing that space for dialogue, for reflection, for joy, for authenticity and genuine ownership in the development and the design of services and spaces, we can manifest new futures. And I still don't know if spaces of care will be a physical installation style space with augmented by digital tech. It could be a digital space with physical sensory aspects. It could be a DIY kit, so you can create hybrid spaces and community connections wherever you are. It could be a way of connecting collective care webs and modeling rest through networks of light or digital content or other digital means. It could be an app. It might be one of these things. It might be something completely different. I'll be doing kind of workshops and more research to explore all of this, but importantly, I'll be continuing to embrace the emergent outcomes of building something with people and really taking our time with it. Next slide, please, Mike. And just to conclude, really, I have so many more questions and critiques about the potentiality of digital placemaking, and lots more to share about the scale of our work, and where it happens and who it includes and doesn't include, and what it means to centre care within our production processes. But you can find out a lot more in the blogs that I've written on the cluster's website. And soon I'll be launching a mini podcast series exploring spaces of care and platforming radical thinkers from Bristol and beyond, so look out for that. And all of this is feeding into some kind of business development that we're doing around creating community space for change makers in Bristol. And final plug is an event that's coming up in November called Anthologies of Care, which I'm co-curating with Gentle Radical. But you can stay up to date with all of that stuff on my Twitter. Thanks for listening and look forward to some questions, hopefully. And I'm going to hand it over to Mike, City ID.
Thanks very much, Roseanna. That's thought-provoking as ever. Wonderful. Okay, I'm going to kind of focus now on really a prototype mapping platform that we've been working on over the last probably 8 months or so. It's changed in its kind of role and dynamics as things have changed in society. But I want to give you a little window into its development, both of which the speakers today have been involved in shaping this as fellows and offering guidance and input along with a whole host of people. So a big thank you to everybody that's been involved thus far. I'm not going to dwell on us. You've heard about us already. However, we've been involved in projects in Bristol going back over 20 years. I love Bristol, I'm fascinated by the city, and I generally call it my home. I really do now. And been lucky enough to be involved in a project called Bristol Legible City going back 20 years. And this is a kind of movement now that's gone right around the world in different forms. And we had and have a long-held vision to kind of think about how we could digitise many of the assets and things that came out of Bristol Legible City. The world's first heads-up mapping, the first on-street mapping and wayfinding system anywhere in the world was developed here, and it's influenced everything from how Olympics have been delivered to how Transport for London works and agencies right around the world. So really important, I think, we bring back further development to this city because it's always been a test bed and a place where we can play and innovate through design processes. And crucially for us, thinking about what localization means in this idea of creating hyperlocal city information that's more relevant and in tune. So we've started bottom up, a completely new system building for the city, which is digitized, which has been co-designed and authored with different partners in the city to bring their kind of sense and direction into content generation and how this is really curated and authored as a system. And really it's being developed as an antidote, I think, to non-place digital services. Ubiquity, there's nothing wrong with Google or Apple or any of these other service providers, but it's really about, well, does any of that really engender this sense of belonging and anchorage that's so important, I think, to users of cities? And I think Roseanna mentioned the word authenticity. How genuine are things and how much they're filled with provenance. Provenance is a hugely important thing about, particularly in terms of data where it comes from, who authors it and controls it, who manages it. I think these things are things we need to reconsider locally. And lastly, that whole vitality and spirit of place is important. To engender a sense of place within the digital perspective, I think, is something that we're looking at. And this is sort of enabling us to look at all sorts of new use cases that might come around from the way we design things, to the use of public space and routes, for instance. How we show walkability within a mapping environment is really, really key to us as well. So the Bristol+Bath Creative R+D project has really given us an opportunity to explore some of these themes and ideas. We've worked with the wonderful team at Calvian, fantastic, and also Nat Robertson at Bristol City Council, again, incredible support we've had from them as well. So I want to show you now a bit more about the platform called PopMap. It is about narrating the city for the city, so by the people, for the people, ultimately. And looking at things like activities in public space and based around mapping the city, maps that you can create based on your location, your preferences, and all the while revealing information around you in a very time-sensitive way. So I'm going to ask Martin now to play a little video of this for us. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to give you a quick guided tour of the app. If you click on the icon for PopMap as it stands on the home screen, it takes you to a map view of the city, depending on your location, here near to St Nicholas Markets. You get a sense immediately of the detail that's included and the clarity to the way the map is drawn, and the fact that you can easily see, for instance, pedestrian space. Again, a unique feature as you scale or zoom in and out, you have a walk circle appears, a bit like on the maps in the city centre. It's built on that same graphic language. And you've got 3D buildings and other features as well, and you can zoom in and you can see a variety of things from cycle parking to here building entrances with the arrow there across the register office, and similarly for the Guildhall and the Crown Courts. All key buildings and features are outlined in this light blue, and you've got green space as well. And then as you move down through to the centre here, you can see a key hierarchy of named buildings and destinations with easy to read pictograms, but also you get an idea very much of how we've designed the map around the use of in public space. Features crop up as you zoom in, so you can see the water areas, the fountains, things like even statues and plinths, and seating, bus shelters. And as I said, it's easy to zoom in and out, and the typography and the quality of that is easy to read. Here you can see steps and various ramps as well as other features. So now if I come to the main menu, that brings up at the moment 4 categories: an area guide, events, destinations, and trails and routes. If I click on the first of those, the area guide, research has told us that when we in cities, it's one of the things that really helps us is to build a mental map of a place. We really need to understand what the particular neighbourhoods or districts of the city are. So within the centre of Bristol, we've identified the key neighbourhoods or districts. As we scroll down, the tab comes up at the bottom here. You can see the types of headline features that are available: theatres, food and drink, coffee shops, those sorts of things. And I scroll left here, up comes the next one, Old Market. These will come up in due course in proximity to where you are. Next one's the shopping quarter. So you get the idea here. Now, linked to these is an area of yellow outlines, which gives you broadly the area itself, and also the fact that these are quite active frontages. So as you zoom out, you get a real picture and flavour for the city in terms of kind of what's live within the city and kind of where to head. You can remove these as well and come back and review the results as you want. Now, if you've had enough of that and you want to come back to the menu and say you want to look at trails and routes, we've got one example to show you today from Harbourside. And again, I think this is the first within an app as we understand it, is that uniquely what we're trying to do is show you actually the space itself to which you can walk in. So that includes pavements, public realm, all joined together, as well as things like Perry's Bridge and detail, which is much clearer than what you see on other apps. And there are all the squares and spaces are listed out, and features along those, where to get ferries, those sorts of things, as well as landmarks and features like Brunel's SS Great Britain, for instance, are all featured. And we're aiming to produce a series of these, everything from walking meetings to guided tours to architectural tours, as well as being able to ultimately produce your favourite and to use the same graphic language to navigate. So once you've found the destination you want to go to, it'll actually draw the route, not just down the centre line of the road, but will pick up all the appropriate pavement spaces and public realm that you can walk to get to that route based on your preferences. So this one's easy, it's mostly flat, it's about 3 miles long, which will maybe take you about an hour, and you'll burn about 300 calories. So we're looking to aim to build out that feature in particular. Just coming back to events, again, I think there's another unique element to all of this, which I'll show you. You've got a whole series of categories here and subcategories of events. Now, what's unique about this is if, for instance, I look for say, let's go to festivals, for example, up comes a clock for you to view and say, okay, I want to finish work around 5:30, no later than 9. I can view my results of what's on. 25 activities come up. The first ones appear relative to your location. And again, you scroll left to right to actually look at these. Within public space, it's just giving you an example of the sorts of things that will feature and appear as you move through the map. And again, you're seeing the tabs below. In due course, you'll be able to add further detail to these, such as take me there, and also necessarily for bookings and other things that you need to do to determine whether you want to go and how you get there and what you can do when you are. So that gives you an overall kind of idea of where this is going. As I said, it's based on preferences, it's based on time, and it's very much based on location, and all designed in a way to reflect Bristol and to show a greater level of detail into the walking environment than any other maps we've ever seen before. So I'll leave it at there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to pass back now to Rachel. Open the conversation up. Thanks very much for listening, everyone.
I'm on mute. Thank you. Thanks to all of you, Stephen, Roseanna and Mike. There were 3 fascinating talks and actually really interesting correlations between the 3 of them, but quite different perspectives. We're now really keen to hear your questions, so please do share them in the chat or you can tweet us. I'm going to kick off with a question and actually bring us back to the title of this talk, Localizing the Internet. We've had a few conversations in our kind of cohort meetups around whether it's localizing the internet or relocalizing the internet. And I guess the question is, was it ever local? I'm going to put that question to you first, Stephen.
It's a good question, and I think the honest answer is sort of yes and no. What's in my mind, I guess, is the very early days in Bristol when there was a physicality to the way that people engaged with digital. I'm thinking of, organisations like Bristol Wireless in East Bristol that were strapping wireless nodes onto council tower blocks and refurbishing servers and computers in order to help people to get online. And sort of over the years, that sense of connection with the physicality of the infrastructure certainly has gone. So we had BNet, and the Bristol Be Open was the wireless network within the city, and everything has gravitated to the cloud. But in so doing, we've lost that sort of sense of local connection. It may or may not be important, but it's a sort of and there are many people for whom this has never been local. It's only ever been a global anonymous facility that's been available. So in some ways, I don't think it matters whether it's localizing or relocalizing. I think it's about whether there are ways that as a city we can take greater agency over the benefits that are delivered by the infrastructure, rather than necessarily rebuilding our own infrastructure ourselves.
Thanks, Stephen. Mike, I wonder if you want to come into that and think about where the value is in hyperlocal, particularly thinking about PopMap and why that's particularly related to the local area.
Yeah, I think Stephen's right. Just pick up on this point about it's not about recreating or repurposing physical infrastructure necessarily. It's, to my mind, about augmenting ubiquitous services and all those sorts of things with more of a flavour of the local narrative, I think, and it feeling, as I said before, in terms of the idea of it feeling more authentic and more provenant. And I think that's as much to do with, in terms of the hyperlocal, is about governance, who does what, who contributes to the internet, and what's done for us, and how permissible is it for us all as individuals and groups, communities and governments, local governments, to actually influence that narrative that's played out on a global stage. And I think if you look at Bristol, there's probably any number of other different companies that we could probably all name that have a view or are talking more about the way Bristol's presented to the world than actually people in Bristol itself. And I think that subtly does have to change. And I think that's certainly one of the ideas behind PopMap, is actually how we change the relationship between people, trust and the internet itself at the local level. I think that's really, really key here. And the fact that what we do locally, and I think one of the benefits is that we can make things more relevant and more resilient if we bring greater transparency to that making process. And I think that's really, really, really key. And I think without that, you will not see a hyper-local solution. You'll see solutions provided for you by others. And I think, what's great about Bristol is the opportunity to kind of turn some of that thinking on its head, at least, to make things more relevant, more resilient, and more for the people that we live with and live around. And that's kind of it for me.
There's a question in the chat from Raquel that leads on really nicely from that, actually. Who defines the local identity? And I wonder if, Roseanna, you might like to have a think about that and share your thoughts.
Yeah, hi Raquel. Great question. I think just picking up on some of the things that were said and kind of threading that into this question, really, I guess what we're speaking about here is the kind of power dynamics around who actually gets to define, as Mike was saying, that narrative and that perception of local place, local story, but also how we move through that space and how value is created in that space. Who gets to decide what is valuable? One of the things that is a really common thread through my work is this idea that actually in Bristol we and elsewhere we struggle with really understanding and mapping and expanding our ideas of what kind of culture is, for example, and how we tell those stories and who gets to tell them. And I think things are shifting and have always been shifting, but are they shifting enough? And are people making space for different narratives to emerge? And in terms of thinking about that, in what that might, how that Bristol character or characteristic of digital space might be, I think there's something there around it not being this limitlessness and relentlessness that we so much experience online, but actually how the hyperlocal can inform and shift that. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. I've got a question here from Tom for Stephen. He says, I love the pictorial representation of markers that tell Bristol as a digital city. I'm interested in failure and wondered if there are examples of failure that are also included.
It's a good question, and I guess it sort of without pushing the question back, it sort of means what do you mean by failure? I often think that the things that we promise at the start of a project meet the requirements of the funder. So it comes back to this idea that we often talk about jobs created and value created in economic terms, whereas actually what we often value the most from projects are the connections and the relationships that are built. So there are many examples where things haven't perhaps delivered the scale of impact that was, potentially envisaged, but they have created spin-out benefits that have perhaps enabled or inspired other people to pick up those ideas and to run with them and to create those sort of unexpected outcomes and outputs. And therefore, I think the real, even if there are failures, the real strength is in the fact that it builds that shared ecosystem network approach. And so if one part of it doesn't deliver, another part of it steps in because it's becoming energized and inspired by the work that's taken place elsewhere. So I hope that answers Marco's question to some extent.
Yeah, I think that there's absolutely added value in the spin-offs and the collaborations, and we hope that happens through this programme as well. Roseanna, there's a question for you here from Jo. She says, what does a space of care look like to you?
Oh, that's a nice question. Thanks, Jo. We talked a lot about so my research was kind of really centered around stories and storytelling, but also the stories that we get told and tell ourselves about our value and our place in the world. And investigating what spaces of care might look like meant really digging into a lot of that stuff around the politics really of productivity, the politics of creating content and for representation for diaspora artists, and actually where that cultural capital kind of gets co-opted and falls down, and essentially how our platforms are not serving us. So when I'm thinking of digital spaces of care, I'm thinking of spaces that completely flip those dynamics on its head. So spaces which favour the relationship that you have with your body in the space that you're in, spaces which allow for each of us to kind of get what we need in that moment from that space, and spaces where we can convene and rest and be together. And in that resting, there's a politicality, because everything is telling us that we are not worthy if we rest. And there's a lot of kind of intersectional politics at play there, in terms of the people that I've been speaking to. So yeah, and if I paint a picture, it would feel soft and fluffy, and there's some work by some fantastic artists which I feature on my blog. I want to know what like a fluffy, comfy space with radical literature and potentialities looks and feels like in digital space. So if anyone has that information, please get in touch.
I don't have that information, but I would love to be there. It sounds fantastic. This sort of leads on to a question for you, Mike, from Raquel, thinking about PopMap. She says, does the map contain any inclusive information? Is it based on an assumed able body?
No, well, what we're trying to do in terms of building out this is to do, we've actually been working with Roseanna on this as well, is to look at aspects of inclusivity in the round. I mean, clearly in terms of mobility impairment and the like, what we're trying to do is enable the collation of a different type of information that you'd see over and above and beyond what you get through Google or Apple or through Waze, for instance. And that really is centered on you as the individual and the fact that you self-curate almost some of the content and some of the input into that process. So the curation behind this in terms of information content is key. Now, at one level, we're looking to the City Council and key partners to provide the official voice or the official sense of the city in terms of what things are called, what things are named, and how they're described. But in terms of then being able to build out a map to reflect your preferences. So for example, if you'd like a buggy-friendly route, you should be able to draw that or see it. If you'd like to burn 200 calories on a lunch hour, you should be able to, again, add that to your preferences and build out the map for you. So we are looking again at that hyper-local level of detail in order to render as many opportunities for people as possible. And I think, you know, we won't, as a company, be the author of all those stories. It is about what Bristol and the people of Bristol would like to see for themselves. And I think, you know, that genuinely would lead to a greater level of inclusivity within mapping, certainly than I've seen thus far, which is broadly about the ability to pay. We would like to turn that on its head and open that out much, much more.
Brilliant, thanks Mike. And Raquel has replied and said, for me that would include resting spaces, changing spaces and quiet spaces,
Yes.
which obviously links really nicely to Roseanna's research as well, and care spaces. I also want to recommend that you have a look at Little Lost Robot, who are another one of our companies who have been developing a prototype in Bath called Stupid Cities, and they're exploring mapping of Bath from the perspective of a wheelchair user and what that means and the microaggressions that you experience as you navigate the city as a wheelchair user. So have a look at that on our website because they're doing some brilliant work as well. So just having a look if we have some more questions. I want to actually ask a question about metrics, because I think there are some really interesting ideas that all three of you have about what we want the future of our cities to look like across the physical and the digital spaces and the layers that we navigate and inhabit in different ways, where we have kind of smart city metrics that perhaps aren't the metrics that that would measure the success of the types of cities we want in the best way that we want. What would be the metrics to measure what we're looking for in these future city spaces that are soft and fluffy and navigable and inclusive and accessible in both the digital and physical layers? Does anybody want to come in on what their metric or metrics would be? Roseanna.
I think just one thing that came to mind straight away really was I think we need to also understand that we need spaces where there's criticality and tension and actually conflict, and that can be a really good thing, that is part of making change. So I think those spaces and the resources and the support for that to happen, that would be really important for me.
Stephen, did you want
did you want to speak, Mike?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think there are any number of metrics that can be looked at related to the greater localization of information and the rest, really. I think much of it is about bringing a sense of confidence in use to people. So when they're in the city, they're in a situation, they feel they're more confident in use. And I think, you know, I think the whole issues of health and well-being are connected here. And that there's an undercurrent to what we're trying to do in terms of things like mapping public space, is to suggest to people that, you know, most proprietary maps are designed for car users, right? And I think what we're trying to engender here is a spirit of walkability in the city, a spirit of being able to dwell, engage, and see and use the city in a different way. And I think that isn't just good for the economy, it's good for our health, it's good for our well-being. It's good to see other people in place using the city and crucially being happy, right? So that's got to be the biggest driver. But I also think there's some direct and measurable benefits. For instance, that if, for instance, within your preferences, you decide, you know, that you may feel you want to memorize, or you may be suffering from dementia. So just to turn on landmarks and plot the landmarks that you see each and every day or on different journeys exploring the city, and then being able to record those and bring them back into play would be useful. As in, similarly, if you had a certain level of impairment and you need benches every 200 meters or something along your walk, that you could plot those and have the confidence in use again. So I think at the end of the day, again, it's about talking to people, understanding needs, and actually trying to mirror those in the digital city we want to portray to people. And I think that's partly the mission. And I think if we can measure that, we'll be moving way beyond what we're currently measuring into profitability and commerce.
I'm conscious we haven't got a lot left, so I'll just add a couple of things. I really agree with both Rosanna and Mike on this, and I really liked in Rosanna's talk that shift towards depth rather than simply breadth in order to really understand the impact of things. I thought it was a very powerful way of framing it. I guess very practically for me, there are some things I would like to see sort of starting to be measured. You know, I'm very conscious of our current situation where not everybody has the ability to work from home. I'd really like a metric that said everybody could walk to a local place of work. So that opportunity to be local and to still stay productive is something that's available to everybody. I'd really like some metrics about people being able to use all of the brilliant sort of tools that the internet delivers in a way that helps them to resolve issues that are affecting their own lives or their own communities. So rather than simply counting the number of people who are online, let's count the number of people who know how to use all of these tools to bring about change. And let's have, you know, much more of a focus as well on a framework that counts economy and productivity, but alongside that recognises inequality and social justice as being equally as important, and the environment and the climate being equally as important. And we need that framework for metrics, a bit like the Sustainable Development Goals, that sort of brings those things together in a local way that makes sense to people. So I think there's a big reframing opportunity that we have at the moment.
Thank you to all three of you. There's some fantastic potential metrics in there that I think we should explore further. I'm afraid we've run out of time today, so thank you again to all of our speakers. If you'd like to find out more, you can read Rosanna and Stephen's full research reports on Bristol+Bath as well as the work of the other fellows. Next spring, we'll be showcasing PopMap along with 3 other digital placemaking prototypes. So sign up to our newsletter and follow us on Twitter at Bristol_Bath R+D to find out more. I'd also like to thank and congratulate all of our fellows for their endless energy, generosity and commitment that they've given to their fellowships. Sean Sobers, Grace Quantock, Tim Lowe, Stephen Hilton, Roseanna Dias, Paul Clark and Will Taylor. It's been a massive privilege to work with all of you. And a big thank you to Sarah Adezio, who is the lead producer on this Pathfinder. Today marks the end of their fellowships, but we're excited to see the ways they'll continue with this thinking and work in the future. As I said, next week's talk is Data Poetics by artist Naho Matsuda from Control Shift, talking about her work This City Is. I would also like to do a really quick plug for the launch of a new podcast called The Residents, a series of 4 podcasts exploring tech, arts, economy and health through the lens of community and creativity, produced by studio residents Will Taylor, who is also a digital placemaking fellow, and Joe Kimber, and supported by the Pervasive Media Studio. You can get news on all of our future talks by following us on @PMStudio UK on Twitter or @Pervasive Media Studio on Instagram, or by subscribing to our newsletter via our website. Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel and give the video a thumbs up. The more subscribers we get and the more likes we get, the more we can share stories like this. Please feel free to share the link to this talk. It's available to watch again as soon as the live broadcast is finished. If you have an idea for your own lunchtime talk, drop us a line and let us know what you want to talk about. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you all here again next week.